Okay, I hope these recordings are helpful or helping you guys out a little bit. And again, if there's anything you could think that would help make them better in terms of sound quality, things like that, or content, just please let me know. By the end of this one, what I want you guys to get out of this is a few key points related to the areas that are detailed in the readings: school access, quality of education, curricular policies, school performance. And then related things, this picks up the reading that we started with last week. And so this time we go into deficit thinking, the impact of IQ testing, um, tracking, segregation, we'll talk about, and a few other contextual factors. All right. I talked the last time sort of about my experience of living in the Southwest. Um, so I can just tell you that like I've seen some of these things in terms of segregated school and major disparities. Um, of course, through the 20th century, things changed pretty dramatically. In the case of Mexican American students, there's a specific kind of legacy of litigation, advocacy, the work of individual scholars, all trying to promote quality education for Mexican students, Mexican American. Deficit thinking was a really, um, I don't know how to say it, but popular, sort of powerful idea that circulated throughout education, and I still think really is sort of ingrained in education. It comes from the what we talked about yesterday with IQ testing. It's kind of blaming the person, and there's three things I want you to associate with it that the authors talk about. It focuses on the individual devoid of context, and that means not asking or looking at things like, does this kid have maybe, language issues as a second language speaker, or do they have issues at home? What other factors could influence their school performance? And you would see today like response to intervention as an example of sort of the legacy here of trying to correct that or deal with that. The other so focuses on the individual devoid of context, blames the victim, and then has a prescriptive aspect. Um, so in terms of blame the victim, rather than examining how schools are structured, or does this have something to do with the teacher, it just blames the person who's struggling to begin with, or maybe the has been the recipient of um, uh, less unequitable education. And then it has a prescriptive aspect, meaning curriculum intervention, segregation, dead end classes, low level vocational classes, those kinds of things. Um, what grew out of the cult or deficit thinking was the culture of poverty, thinking that the poor sort of create a subculture, are responsible for their own problems, culturally deprived. So the idea of you need to remove the primary culture of the students. Um, if you ever saw the show The Wire, I grew up in Baltimore, so The Wire was of particular interest to me. But there were classes at Harvard and Duke and other um, major universities that use The Wire as a way to examine sociology in the city. And I think it was the third or fourth season that focused on the education system, and you really kind of see the kids. Um, I think it shows you from the micro level, and then it kind of goes out to the broader macro level. You really see how the kids are influenced by more structural kind of factors. So inferior schooling, if you read this section, they describe some of the schools in the area as sort of matchbox because they were just built out of wood. They often didn't have indoor plumbing, didn't have suitable facilities, didn't have refrigerated air or air conditioning at that time period. Lack of services, and you saw real disparities. So and we're talking about segregated schools here. So the Anglo schools had medical facilities, adequate funding, class sizes that were manageable, whereas for Mexican American students, sometimes there were up to 40, 47 kids in a class. And if you guys have taught or done practicums, you know the class size makes a difference. And this was followed by things like really low completion rates for school, other factors. I'll just tell you, like when I worked in the Southwest, I've seen a number of schools, really underfunded Title I, predominantly Mexican American schools, still sort of throughout the Southwest. Um, Parents struggle against segregation in the form of lawsuits and other forms of educational advocacy. Uh, and this really, you get a movement after the war because a lot of Hispanic people went and fought in the war and then came back, and even though they had sacrificed on behalf of the country, they come back and their kids still have to go to a separate segregated school. There were a number of different cases, and I'll come to the one I want you guys to know, Alvarez v. Lemon Grove. But I'll quickly just kind of mention like the Salvatierra case um, uh, was in Texas. There had always been a question um, about using the terms like color. What students fall under that banner? Is that Italian students, Jewish students, Mexican students, African American students? So we've always had this kind of ambiguous or complex, issue with racial categories in the U.S. It comes to things like this. So these other cases challenge segregated schooling, and both in Texas and California. And I mentioned this last week, but in particular, Texas and California have traditionally had a more negative, I think, or hostile relationship with the Hispanic community. And I will say, though, that today that's changing a bit. And Texas is actually doing some positive things. Um, and there's some really positive areas of Texas, too, I think, that are doing good things with the Hispanic community and ESL students and other things. And Arizona now is really kind of taking over as a more problematic area, and I'll actually come back to that in a little bit. So the one I want you to know is Alvarez v. Lemon Grove. This is a district in California, considered the nation's first successful court or desegregation case. Um, they were proposing to build a new school just for Mexican students. It was overcrowded. They called it La Cabaraza, the stable, and parents challenged that and wanted better educational opportunity for their kids. And the judge ruled in favor of the parents, and he said segregation holds the kids back culturally. It keeps them from developing English properly. It has these negative side effects. So the problem was, though, that it didn't have a precedent-setting effect. So it was at a local level. It didn't influence other districts or other cases. Um, this is a picture of the class of Lemon Grove, the kids. Um, so that's what I want you to know about the case, and those kind of three things. First, successful desegregation case, no precedent-setting effect, and only affected a local area. Didn't really change things for other students in the Southwest. All right, we talked about IQ testing yesterday, and here with Mexican American students, it had a particularly damaging effect. Kids were basically given tests in English, and you might know that even if they spoke English, if English wasn't their um, fluent language or their first language, because IQ testing is based on processing time and speed, that time it takes to sort of process things and think about them and then come back with an answer affects your score. And IQ testing led to over 50% of Mexican American students being labeled mentally sub-average or mentally defective. Um, Jorge Isidore Sanchez was a scholar who did extensive research to challenge these ideas and showed that the educational performance of students had to do more with their underfunding in schools and other issues that the IQ tests were, and so he helped sort of change the perception. And the Education College at the University of Texas Austin is named after him, so bears his name. Um, so I ask a little bit about challenges that confront Mexican American students today. We're going to talk about some things in a few weeks, like tracking and other things that relate to what we're talking about now. There's still those issues that happen. Maybe it's something for you to think about. I do want to mention too. They talk about discrimination against students in terms of curricula throughout the Southwest in both of the readings, and I just wanted to point out about 10 years ago, Arizona banned their ethnic studies program for Mexican American students in particular. It's detailed in a video that I posted for you guys. That was just overturned about a year ago by I want to say a federal judge maybe, or a judge at the Arizona level. I can't remember. But they literally banned books. They banned a number of books, and they banned a very popular Mexican American Studies program that had really positive results. It had increased retention rates, increased test scores, a lot of positive aspects to it. And I think the biggest thing that bothered me was that there was a real breakdown between the school administration and the teachers that ran the program and the teachers in Tucson. Um, so it was incredibly unfortunate. And I think, again, banning books in the U.S. is something that weren't obscene, or they were just, about Mexican culture or Mexican American history. Um, and again, if you get a chance to watch the video, I would recommend it. And I just want to point out that the positive that came from this was that it led to a push for ethnic studies classes around the United States. And as a result, recently, Governor Holcomb, I might have just butchered his name a little bit, but signed a law for Indiana requiring ethnic studies in our high schools. And so I felt that was a really positive, positive law and positive bill. And, it's something for you guys to think about. I do think ethnic studies. I think ideally you would begin to see a more broad kind of encompassing history more generally, but I think until you get that, it's helpful to have ethnic studies and as students to be able to look at things from different perspectives and look at other people's histories and culture. So now I want to talk about the Mays report and the specific areas that I'll have them that I kind of outline here for you: school segregation, academic performance, retention, curriculum differentiation, language exclusion, and enrollment in higher ed. And for each of these, there's a few key points that I wanted you to be familiar with. So I'm going to try to walk through these really quickly. So we've done so segregation. You see the major disparities between, like, and again, California and Texas, where I mentioned that they were particularly bad, but in Texas, basically, even by the 1930s, 90% were segregated. And a key point to remember here, this is the key, that since the Mays report, since the 1960s to today, segregation has increased. And that's Gary Orfield, and we'll talk about this when we get to Brown versus Board. He considers anything that's basically like 90% or higher in terms of population of Hispanic students to be a segregated school. And given that definition, that segregation has increased. In terms of academic performance, I would just mention that there were major gaps between Anglo students and Mexican Americans, and this is sort of captured with the data of the Texas Assessment of Academic Skills. I don't know if they still have it, but this was really impactful because Texas had a exit exam that you had to pass to get out of high school, and so that became a huge problem. But you see, like 83% of white sixth graders passing all parts, reading, writing, and math, in contrast to 55% of Latino students, and sort of continuing problems. In terms of retention, and I think it's important to note that they purposely use this term as opposed to dropout, because they want to emphasize the responsibility of the school and place an emphasis on that. And again, the places where you see the highest rates of of school completion rates were in California, in Texas, or I'm sorry, the highest, like basically the lowest retention rates were, and then the highest retention rates, the most positive, were New Mexico, Colorado, at 71%. But you have to, I mean, try to wrap your head around this. The periods where Texas had a 53% retention rate, that means they lost roughly half of their Mexican American students in a state that's heavily Hispanic. And California didn't do much better with 64%. So that's has a huge impact. In terms of curriculum differentiation, Mexican American students, this is the key point, overrepresented by more than twofold, so by more than double, in low ability classes, vocational classes, things like that. Underrepresented by twofold, or more, more than double, in high ability classes and instruction. And another example here would be a 685 individual disparity analysis for mathematics, science, and English, underrepresented in college prep. Language exclusion, the next one, that less than 7% of schools in the Southwest offered bilingual education. So again, less than 7% of schools in the Southwest offered bilingual education. And the other phrase that I wanted you to remember from this section is Hispanic students were subjected to the sink or swim pedagogical practice of English-only instruction. And that's something I've seen as well too, that immersive, when just kids are just put into an English-speaking class when they don't really speak English fluently. Some kind of can rise to the occasion and get it, and others sink. I took an immersion French class, and I ended up dropping the class the first time. It was with a Parisian woman who refused, even during office hours, to speak to me in English. And then I had another instructor who taught it, who was willing to talk to me. And just those few times going to office hours and talking to him helped me sort of get over hurdles in places where I was struggling. So yeah, it was just something I can relate to. And then enrollment in higher education, that there are huge disparities between Anglos and Hispanics. With Anglos, you have about a 6% raising to a 9% in the mid 90s of college enrollment, whereas for whites it's up around 24%. So huge disparities, both in terms of college enrollment. In 5 southwestern states, almost 50% of white students, with 24% completing, 23% Mexican American with only 5% completing. And I'll just tell you, for today, there's been an uptick in Hispanic enrollment in higher education along with African American enrollment. That's very positive and good, but you still see disparities where there's much higher. You still see high. Where that's gone up are places like 2-year colleges, community colleges, and so still major disparities that exist. So some improvement, but some issues as well. So, all right, I think that really hits on a lot of the kind of key points. I think I've covered all of these, but you might look over them. And then what I want to end with is just mentioning what administrators and teachers could do to increase high school retention. And I mentioned to you guys that that Indiana was on the cover of Time magazine under the heading "Dropout Nation," highlighting the problem in our state. And it does have a huge problem economically. Of course, there's the one person that drops out and does really well, but by and large, people who drop out of school end up becoming a strain. They end up consuming resources, welfare, food stamps, things like that. People who graduate more often go on to become contributors. They contribute to the tax base, things like that. So it has a really profound effect on society, and that's why I think people are taking an active kind of, actively engaging and I mentioned the disparities that exist. If you get a chance to watch the story of Omarina, I would just highly recommend it. It has a very innovative program um, that and Indiana's kind of tried two things. One is credit recovery, which I don't like so much. I mean, I don't think it's horrible or inherently negative, but it's just having kids take classes online where they can go through the information very quickly, but it's not clear to me that they really gain the skills they need to be successful, after graduation. Um, and then the thing that I do like are programs, and a lot of schools have put these in place, similar to the one at Omarina School, where they try to pay attention to warning signs when students are struggling. And that's what I wanted you to pay attention to. There's an extra credit question on the exam or quiz that's about the Robert Belfans data, and there's 3 indicators that he pointed out that where you can tell, I think almost with 90% accuracy, if a kid hits all 3 of those indicators, there's like a 90% chance that they'll drop out, 80 or 90 maybe, that they'll drop out in high school. And with Omarina, they step in and intervene. So it's an interesting story because you get to see her life trajectory, where they follow her from when she was in middle school, which is one of the key kind of flashpoints, through high school, and then on when she graduated. She was recently accepted to college and go on. And then you also see the story though of her twin brother, who was in a different school and didn't have the intervention, and kind of his life trajectory. Um, so um, so yeah, if you get to see it, I think there's a lot of value in it. Like I said, there's an extra credit based on it. Question. There's also an extra credit question based on the video that I shared with you guys from the ethnic studies ban in Arizona. So, all right, I hope this was helpful, and email me any questions or thoughts or reflections you guys have.